pretty good team.
That was pretty. It was
What
pretty
made
decent.
that team so good, you two?
Welcome back to Clark USA fans. For months, the narrative sounded polished, convincing, almost too clean to question. It echoed across talk shows, social media threads, and highlight debates. Something wasn't quite right in Indiana. People speculated about chemistry, about leadership, about whether two rising stars could truly coexist under the weight of expectation. But here's the thing about narratives. They often grow loudest in rooms where the truth is quiet. And then, finally, someone who actually lives inside that reality decided to speak, not a commentator chasing clicks, not a former player revisiting old rivalries, but a teammate. Someone who shares the locker room, the practices, the grind, and the unfiltered moments that cameras never capture. While voices like Sheryl Swoopes raised questions about Caitlin Clark and the Fever's internal dynamic, it created an easy assumption for the outside world. There must be tension. There must be something off. That assumption fed the machine. But then Aliyah Boston sat down, calm and composed, in a conversation with Sue Bird, and without theatrics, without trying to win a headline, she quietly dismantled the entire narrative. No drama. No exaggeration, just clarity. And what she revealed wasn't just a different perspective, it was a complete shift in understanding. Suddenly, the gap between what people believed and what was actually happening behind closed doors became impossible to ignore. Boston didn't sound defensive. She didn't sound frustrated. She sounded settled, focused, ready. Now we can take a breath, she explained, pointing toward the start of the season, a reset not just for the team, but for the noise surrounding it. And that's when it hits you. When someone inside the system speaks with that level of calm confidence, you have to start questioning who's really been controlling the story all along. Because when perception and reality collide like that, only one of them survives. To understand why this matters, you have to go back, before Indiana, before the WNBA spotlight, before the debates. Back to one of the biggest stages in college basketball, the 2023 NCAA Women's Final Four. South Carolina versus Iowa. Over 15,000 fans packed into the arena in Dallas, millions more watching from home. It wasn't just a game, it was an event. A moment where legacies are built or broken. Aliyah Boston entered that night as the reigning National Player of the Year, the cornerstone of a dominant South Carolina program led by Dawn Staley. She wasn't just expected to perform, she was expected to own the stage. And then Caitlin Clark happened. 41 points. In a Final Four game. Against one of the most disciplined defensive teams in the country. Shots from well beyond the arc drives through traffic. A level of confidence that didn't just challenge the defense, it overwhelmed it. It wasn't just scoring, it was a takeover. The kind of performance that forces everyone watching to stop analyzing and just witness. Iowa won that game, and even though South Carolina would go on to reclaim the national title the following year, that night belonged entirely to Clark. Moments like that don't fade easily. Athletes remember. Competitors especially. There's a certain imprint left behind when someone dominates on that level on that stage. It lingers, not always as resentment, but as something unresolved. So when fate brought Boston and Clark onto the same roster in Indiana after the 2024 WNBA draft, Clark as the #1 overall pick, Boston already established as a foundational piece, it could have been awkward. It could have been tense. It could have quietly fractured before it even began. But Boston didn't allow that. Instead of letting that memory sit in the background, unspoken and potentially toxic, she addressed it immediately. No hesitation.
But they're not going to do that. And with Noelle Quinn, as you mentioned, no challenge.
Clark.
No ego. She walked up to Clark and said exactly what needed to be said. You didn't have to do all that. It wasn't anger, it was honesty wrapped in humor. Acknowledgement without bitterness. And in that moment, something important happened. The past was recognized, but it wasn't allowed to define the future. That kind of emotional intelligence is rare. In professional sports, where pride and competition often blur into ego, it's easy for small things to grow into real problems. History is full of examples, teams stacked with talent that never quite clicked because relationships were never properly built. Boston chose a different path. She cleared the air, laughed about it, and moved forward. And by doing that, she created space for something much more valuable than individual success: trust. And trust is everything, especially when one of those players is Caitlin Clark. Because Clark didn't enter the WNBA quietly. She arrived as a phenomenon. The most talked about rookie in the history of the league. Record-breaking viewership followed her from college. Her jersey became the best-selling in WNBA history before she even stepped onto the court. Every move, every shot, every expression analyzed, debated, amplified. That kind of attention doesn't just affect the player, it affects everyone around them. So imagine trying to build real chemistry in that environment. Not for the cameras, not for headlines, but actual, functional basketball chemistry, the kind that shows up in split-second decisions during games. That requires focus. It requires discipline. And most importantly, it requires both players to completely tune out the noise. That's exactly what Boston and Clark did. Their mindset was simple. We're on the same team now, let's make it a problem for everyone else. And that mentality became the foundation for everything that followed. Because chemistry in basketball isn't something you declare, it's something you build, rep by rep, possession by possession. It shows up in the small details. Timing on a screen. Trust in a pass. Knowing where your teammate will be without looking. Boston described those moments in a way that reveals just how real their connection is becoming. The pick and roll, one of the most fundamental plays in basketball, has already started evolving into something dangerous between them. If defenders hesitate, Clark shoots, and more often than not, she makes them pay. If defenses adjust, Clark adapts instantly, finding angles and passing windows that most players don't even see. And Boston? She's learning it in real time. Adjusting her positioning, setting stronger screens, recognizing patterns. This isn't forced chemistry. This is organic development. The early stages of a partnership that has the potential to grow into something special. And here's what makes it even more important. This is happening while the outside world is still trying to question whether it exists at all. That disconnect between perception and reality? That's where the real story lives. Because while the narrative debates continue, inside the gym, inside the locker room, inside the game itself, two elite players are quietly building something that doesn't need validation from anyone watching. So the next time you hear someone question what's happening in Indiana, remember this: the people closest to the truth aren't speaking with doubt, they're speaking with clarity. And when clarity replaces noise, the story changes completely.
Here comes Sabali. Clark.
What separates a good player from a generational one isn't just talent. It's timing, vision, and the ability to see something before it even exists. And that's exactly where this story takes a deeper turn. Because when Aliyah Boston began describing what it actually feels like to share the floor with Caitlin Clark, she didn't talk about hype, headlines, or highlight reels. She talked about something far more dangerous for the rest of the league: anticipation. The kind of anticipation that turns split-second decisions into unstoppable plays. Clark doesn't just react to what's happening on the court. She reads it as it's forming, sometimes even before it fully takes shape. She delivers the ball not where a player is, but where they're about to be, often before defenders have even completed their rotations. And that tiny difference, that fraction of a second, is everything at the professional level. It's the difference between a contested possession and an easy bucket, between a defense recovering and a defense collapsing. But here's where it becomes even more fascinating. Boston revealed that she doesn't track the ball when Clark has it. She watches Clark's eyes. That detail might sound small to casual fans, but in reality, it's the foundation of elite-level chemistry. Because eyes don't lie in basketball. They reveal intent before the body commits to action. And Boston has learned to read that language in real time. When Clark's gaze shifts, Boston reacts, cutting at the perfect moment, rolling into open space, sealing defenders, or drifting into position without a single word being exchanged. No hand signals. No calling for the ball. No hesitation. Just instinct meeting instinct. Two players syncing up in a way that feels less like coordination and more like shared awareness, as if for a brief moment, they're operating with the same mind. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because we've seen glimpses of this kind of connection before in basketball history. Steve Nash once described a similar dynamic with Amare Stoudemire during their time in Phoenix, a partnership where Stoudemire didn't need to search for the ball because he already knew when and where it was coming. That Suns pick and roll became one of the most efficient and feared offensive weapons the game had ever seen, not because it was complicated, but because it was executed with perfect understanding. And while Boston and Clark are still at the beginning of their journey together, the blueprint is strikingly similar. An elite playmaker with deep shooting range paired with a versatile big who processes the game in real time. It's not just promising, it's potentially transformative. Right now, what we're witnessing isn't a finished product. It's the early construction of something that could eventually dominate the WNBA. Boston didn't need to use technical jargon or over-the-top comparisons to explain it. Her words, simple and honest, painted a clear picture. This is a two-player game developing in front of us, one that defenses will struggle to solve as it matures. Because when you break it down, the math becomes brutal for opposing teams. If defenders sag off Clark, she'll punish them from deep. She's already proven she can shoot at elite percentages when given space. If they step up to contest, she'll dissect them with her passing, finding Boston in positions where she thrives near the rim, in motion with leverage. You can't help too aggressively because Boston will capitalize inside. You can't switch comfortably because mismatches appear instantly on either end. Every adjustment creates another problem. Every solution opens a new weakness. And as they continue to build rhythm and familiarity, that equation only becomes more difficult to manage. But Boston made it clear that Clark's impact goes beyond just their two-player connection. It extends across the entire team, and even beyond that, across the entire league. She spoke about it without hesitation, acknowledging something that many players might struggle to express openly. Clark has changed the visibility of the WNBA. People show up to watch her, yes, but they stay because they discover everything else the league has to offer. That's not just praise, it's perspective. It's the understanding that one player's spotlight can illuminate an entire ecosystem. And the numbers support it. Attendance surged. Television ratings climbed. Arenas that once struggled to fill seats suddenly became packed when the Fever came to town. Clark didn't just bring attention, she shifted the economic and cultural momentum of the league. What's remarkable is how Boston framed all of this. There was no hint of jealousy, no guarded tone, no sense of being overshadowed. Instead, there was confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing your own value doesn't diminish just because someone else is shining. She embraced the moment, recognizing that growth at the top benefits everyone. That kind of maturity isn't common, especially in an environment where comparisons are constant and narratives often try to pit players against each other. But Boston didn't feed into that. She leaned into partnership instead of competition, into collaboration instead of insecurity. And that's exactly why this connection feels different. Because it's not just built on skill, it's built on mutual respect. They're not just figuring out how to play together, they genuinely enjoy it. And that matters more than people realize. In professional basketball, chemistry often takes an entire season or longer to develop. It requires repetition, trust, and time. Yet here they are, already showing signs of a connection that usually takes years to form. The fact that Boston is already reading Clark's eyes, already anticipating her decisions, already adjusting in sync, that tells you everything about the trajectory they're on. Which makes what comes next even more important to address. Because while this partnership has been quietly growing stronger on the court, a completely different story has been spreading off it. If you spent any time on basketball social media during the Fever's 2024 season, you probably encountered one of the most exaggerated and baseless narratives in recent memory. The idea that the Indiana Fever locker room was somehow fractured, divided, even toxic. Claims that Boston resented Clark. That veterans were isolating her. That subtle body language during timeouts was proof of deeper issues. Entire discussions, threads, and videos were built around interpreting facial expressions and creating drama out of thin air. And Boston addressed it in the most effective way possible, not with anger, but with reality. She shared a moment that perfectly exposed how disconnected that narrative was from the truth. On a day when the online speculation was at its peak, when people were dissecting every frame of footage looking for signs of tension, Boston was doing something completely normal, taking a pre-game nap. When she woke up and checked her phone, she discovered that the internet had essentially written a full-blown drama about her team while she was asleep. Think about that for a second. While the outside world was convinced something was wrong, the people actually living inside that environment weren't experiencing any of it. Boston walked into the locker room, casually asked her teammates if everything was good, and was met with confusion, because as far as they were concerned, nothing had ever been wrong in the first place. The so-called crisis didn't exist in reality. It existed entirely online, created and fueled by people with no direct connection to the team. And Boston didn't just dismiss it, she explained why it happens. She pointed out something that every competitor understands, but many observers ignore. Frustration is part of the game. When players have a bad performance, it shows. In their expressions. In their body language. That doesn't mean there's conflict within the team, it means they care. It means they're holding themselves to a high standard. But in an era where every moment is captured, replayed, and analyzed, even normal reactions can be misinterpreted and turned into something they're not. She also made another crucial point. If there were a real issue inside that locker room, the public wouldn't be decoding it from camera angles or sideline shots. Professional teams don't operate like that. Real problems don't reveal themselves through a glance or a gesture captured from across the court. The idea that outsiders could somehow uncover hidden tension that the players themselves were unaware of isn't just unlikely, it's unrealistic. And Boston understood that. She didn't let it affect her because she knew the truth didn't match the noise. But the impact of that narrative wasn't harmless. It fed into a larger conversation, one that tried to paint Clark as a disruptive presence, someone whose arrival created division rather than unity. Every false claim about locker room tension reinforced that image, whether intentionally or not. And voices like Sheryl Swoopes amplified those ideas, suggesting that there were internal issues, that something behind the scenes wasn't adding up. What Boston did, without directly attacking anyone, was dismantle that entire framework. She replaced speculation with first-hand experience. She replaced assumptions with clarity. And in doing so, she reminded everyone of something important. There's a difference between watching a story and actually living it. Because while the noise continues, while debates keep cycling, while narratives rise and fall, one thing remains consistent. Inside that locker room, inside those games.
A little bit earlier, I asked Diana, what was your playing weight that you...
Inside those moments that don't make headlines, this team is building something real. And at the center of it, two players are developing a connection that doesn't need validation from anyone outside of it.by the time the noise reached its peak. The story being told outside the Indiana Fever organization had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just speculation anymore. It had evolved into something that sounded authoritative, repeated so often that it began to feel like fact. The idea that Caitlin Clark's arrival had disrupted the locker room, that players were unhappy, that the chemistry was fragile, that the entire experiment was somehow backfiring, these claims echoed across platforms, amplified by voices who spoke with confidence despite being far removed from the reality they were describing. And every time those claims were repeated, they gained more traction, more attention, more belief. But here's the critical flaw. None of it was rooted in what was actually happening inside the room. Aliyah Boston's perspective didn't just challenge that narrative, it dismantled it completely. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with clarity so grounded in lived experience that it left very little room for interpretation. She made it clear that from the very beginning, the team was unified. There was no hidden divide, no silent resentment, no fractured dynamic waiting to be exposed. What existed instead was a group of players building something real, something that couldn't be fully understood from the outside, because it was being developed in the everyday moments that never make headlines. Practices, film sessions, conversations, adjustments, growth. The kind of foundation that doesn't announce itself loudly, but becomes undeniable over time. What makes this even more striking is how effortlessly Boston revealed the gap between reality and perception. She didn't need to call anyone out directly. She didn't need to create confrontation or escalate the conversation. She simply described what she had experienced firsthand, and in doing so, the contrast became obvious. On one side, there were assumptions built on distance, interpretations built on incomplete information, narratives shaped by observation rather than participation. On the other side, there was someone who was actually there living it, contributing to it, understanding it from within. And when those two perspectives collide, it becomes clear which one carries more weight. That's what made this moment so significant. It wasn't just about correcting a misconception, it was about exposing how easily narratives can form when there's a vacuum of direct insight. And for the audience, it created a choice: continue believing the speculation, or listen to the voice that comes from inside the experience itself. Because at some point, credibility matters. And in this case, the difference between guessing and knowing couldn't have been clearer. As the season unfolded, the Indiana Fever began to show signs of progress that went beyond individual performances. They reached the playoffs for the first time in years, a milestone that signaled a shift in direction for the franchise. And while their postseason run was brief, ending against a more experienced Connecticut team, the takeaway wasn't disappointment. At least, not in the way outsiders might expect. Boston didn't frame it as a feel-good achievement or a stepping stone to be politely acknowledged. She spoke about it with a sense of urgency, almost frustration, not because they failed, but because they were close. Close enough to see what was possible, close enough to feel what it would take to get there again and finish the job. She believed they could have pushed the series further. Not hoped, believed. And that distinction matters. Because hope is passive. Belief is active. It reflects a mindset that doesn't settle for participation, but demands progression. Boston's perspective revealed something deeper about the team's identity. They weren't satisfied with simply arriving. They were already thinking about what it would take to stay and to win. And when she broke down the difference between Indiana and a team like Connecticut, she didn't point to talent gaps or systemic flaws. She pointed to experience. The kind of experience that only comes from being in those moments repeatedly, understanding when to stay composed, when to push, when to recognize the subtle shifts in momentum that decide playoff games. It's not about ability, it's about control. And that's something younger teams often have to learn the hard way. But instead of treating that gap as a limitation, Indiana turned it into fuel. Because experience can't be rushed, but it can be accelerated through adversity. And that's exactly what happened as the transition into the next season began. The expectations surrounding the Fever changed dramatically. What was once a team trying to rebuild quietly became a team expected to compete loudly.
Absolutely blown the roof off.
But playing at UConn, she is.
A new coaching presence under Stephanie White, key roster additions, and the continued development of their core shifted the narrative entirely. They were no longer underdogs, they were targets. Every opponent circled them. Every game carried weight. Every performance was evaluated through the lens of expectation rather than potential. But internally, that shift didn't create pressure, it reinforced purpose. Boston made it clear that the team's standards weren't dictated by external voices. They had already set their own expectations, and those expectations were higher than anything being projected from the outside. That kind of internal alignment is rare, especially for a young team navigating rapid change. It speaks to leadership, to accountability, to a shared understanding of what they're trying to build. Boston herself emerged as a central pillar in that structure. Described as the rock of the team, she embodied consistency, resilience, and composure. Not in a way that draws constant attention, but in a way that stabilizes everything around her. She carried responsibility without being overwhelmed by it, which allowed her to remain effective even as circumstances shifted. And then came one of the most challenging moments of the season, Caitlin Clark's injury. For a team that had begun to shape its identity around her unique skill set, losing her presence could have derailed everything. It could have disrupted rhythm, confidence, direction. But instead, it revealed something important about the Fever's mindset. From the very beginning, the team had embraced a next woman up mentality, not as a cliche, but as a principle. It wasn't just something written on a board, it was something practiced, expected, and internalized. When Clark went down, the response wasn't panic. It was adjustment. Players stepped into larger roles. Responsibilities shifted. The system adapted. And most importantly, the belief didn't waver. Boston acknowledged that the team plays differently with Clark on the floor, and that difference is significant. With Clark, the game speeds up. The tempo increases. The transition becomes more aggressive. There's an urgency to push the ball, to create opportunities before defenses can organize. It requires readiness, awareness, and constant movement. Without her, the style changes. The pace slows. The offense becomes more deliberate, more structured, more reliant on execution within the half-court. And instead of viewing that shift as a disadvantage, Boston framed it as versatility. The ability to operate effectively in multiple systems, to adjust based on personnel, to remain competitive regardless of circumstances, that's not a weakness. That's strength. Because championship-level teams aren't defined by how they perform when everything is ideal. They're defined by how they respond when things aren't. And Indiana, through those challenging stretches, developed something that can't be easily quantified: resilience. The kind that comes from navigating uncertainty, from competing without your best player, from finding ways to win, or at least to endure, when the situation demands it. There's also an emotional component to that process. Watching a teammate like Clark, someone so integral to the team's identity, go down isn't easy. It affects the group. It changes the dynamic. But Boston's response reflected confidence, not concern. Clark would return. And when she did, she wouldn't be coming back to a team that had fallen apart. She'd be returning to one that had held its ground. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when the postseason arrives, pressure doesn't just test skill, it tests stability. And a team that has already faced adversity, already adapted, already proven it can survive difficult stretches, that team doesn't break easily. It bends. It adjusts. It competes. Which brings everything back to where this story started, the noise. For months, the narrative surrounding Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever was built from a distance. It was shaped by observation, interpretation, and assumption. But inside the locker room, inside the games, inside the day-to-day reality of building a team, something entirely different was taking place. Something quieter. Something more deliberate. Something real. While critics questioned the foundation was strengthening. Possession by possession. Practice by practice. Moment by moment. And now, as those internal truths begin to surface through voices like Aliyah Boston's, the narrative is shifting. Not because it was argued against, but because it was revealed for what it was. This was never about drama. It was about development. About timing. About two players learning each other at a pace that the rest of the league hasn't fully adjusted to yet. About a team growing into its identity without needing external validation to confirm it. And now, the conversation changes.